Okay, here I go.
I'm sitting still.
Hello?
Ellen.
John, is that you?
It's me. It's me, calling from Barcelona. Now, I think you knew I was here recording for our project.
I did. I'm jealous I'm not there with you, but I want to hear everything.
Well, you will. For the moment, though, and this is really not by any means the main reason I came to Barcelona, but I'm sitting here in a little outdoor cafe looking up at the monument to Christopher Columbus. Prominent landmark here in Barcelona, basically overlooking the port. It's one of these that's on a tall column, 60 meters high, that's almost 200 feet. Columbus is standing atop this, the 24-foot bronze statue of Columbus, and he is pointing, not pointing to the west, which he is famous for having gone in that direction, but he's pointing, I guess, to the nearest body of water, which he's pointing out over the Mediterranean and over the port.
Okay, I've seen pictures. It's a pretty grand, elaborate thing, and that is a real power pose he's taking up there.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
This was erected in 1880s. Barcelona was going to be the site of the Expo, the World's Fair, and they built it for that occasion, which is a real flex, isn't it?
Yeah, I find it so interesting that so many years later, from his initial journey, that it was still so important for them to highlight this. Barcelona, Catalonia, this was the new world. They were opening it up, and they were still pretty proud of it. Still going strong as a colonial power, so that's good to remember, I guess.
That's such a good point you made, Ellen, that at the time Spain put up the Columbus Monument in 1888, it was still a colonial power, although really kind of an empire on its last legs.
It's interesting, right? Most of its colonies in what we now call Latin America had gained independence earlier in the 19th century, from Chile and Argentina to Mexico.
And the Spaniards were trying to hold on to what was left.
Right. For example, Cuba, one of its remaining colonies, was giving Spain a lot of trouble. Coincidentally, Cuba was one of the places that Christopher Columbus discovered in 1492, yes, I use big air quotes there, and colonized for Spain.
Colonized for Spain even though he was Italian. And by the way, his name in Italian would have been Colombo, which I kind of enjoy.
Me too. I could see why. But yes, he was on a mission for Ferdinand and Isabella, the king and queen of Spain.
And he came back from the New World to report to them in Barcelona, which is a big reason the city put up the monument to claim him. Hey, that historic, world-changing voyage, that was us. But, Ellen, you were saying something about Cuba.
Yes. In the 1870s and the 80s, the Cuban people were rebelling hard against Spanish rule. So were the Filipinos in another Spanish colony.
Spain would soon lose Cuba and the Philippines to the United States in the Spanish-American War of 1898, along with Puerto Rico and Guam, which are still U.S. territories to this day. That was America's major venture into the most literal, old-school kind of colonialism when it seized those colonies from Spain.
But I do wonder if the fact that Spain's empire was crumbling in the late 19th century, was that one reason the Spanish wanted to put up a Columbus statue at that time? I mean, precisely because its old dominance was slipping away?
Yeah, maybe to make a statement, sort of like the southern states in the U.S. that built Confederate monuments, not right after the Civil War, but later in the 20th century.
In some cases, actually during the Civil Rights Movement, when white supremacists felt very much under attack.
We talked about that a little when I called you from Barcelona, the fact that almost 400 years after Columbus's first voyage, Spain was still embracing him so proudly and what he represented.
I imagine they weren't saying much about the unspeakable violence and genocide that his voyages unleashed on indigenous people in the Caribbean and the Americas.
And here we are now, almost 150 years after the monument was built, and as you can imagine, opinions have shifted and become a little more ambivalent here in Spain as well as in the U.S. about this man.
Columbus has lost his day in lots of communities around the U.S., right? Like Columbus Day is now Indigenous Peoples Day, lots of places. That's a pretty dramatic reversal of the kind of regard we just gave him without really thinking it through.
Yes, and a number of Columbus statues in the U.S. have come down in recent years. But it's still here. There have been some protests for years in Barcelona. You know, he's an interesting guy. Apparently he had a mixture of motivations. Apparently he really did want the victory for Christianity, which meant the conquest of the infidel. He wanted to really lead the way on that. And he also wanted to go get some gold and get rich for his patrons.
Yeah.
It's really a significant marker at the dawn of what would become capitalism. From the Kenan Institute for Ethics at Duke University, this is Scene on Radio, Season 7, Capitalism, Episode 3. I'm John Biewen.
And I'm Ellen McGirt.
We're telling the story of the world's dominant economic system and how it took the forms that it did.
And what to do about it now. In this moment, when a lot of people believe capitalism is not the solution, but a big part of the problem, what are some ways we might fix the system or transform it? We'll tackle that question later in the series.
In this episode, the big shift, the gradual, painful, world-shaking birth of a capitalist world, as feudalism dissolved in Europe. Was it inevitable that the next stage after the fall of the medieval world would be capitalism?
You know, the transition from feudalism to capitalism is often described as a shift from bondage to freedom. And it was, in some ways, and of course, for some people. But John, you spent a year on this, studying the history, and you found the full picture is way more complicated, and that Europeans fought hard over the post-medieval world and what it would look like.
Like most struggles, that fight was not waged on a level playing field. Some people had a lot more power than others to shape what we call the modern world.
All right, we left off in Episode 2 with feudalism on the ropes. John, take it away.
We're focusing on Britain in these early episodes because capitalism would emerge most aggressively there. But it's worth repeating that before its rise as a colonial empire, England was just another country. In the 14th century, the Mali Empire was piling up wealth through its control of gold and salt trades in West Africa. Some have claimed that its leader, Mansa Musa, was the richest man in history. In the following centuries, too, the richest kingdoms were in places other than Europe.
Well, definitely in the 15th and 16th centuries, China and India were the richest countries in the world, and there's a lot of historical research.
Jayati Ghosh is a leading Indian economist, now at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst.
Joseph Needham had a remarkable set of volumes on history and civilization in China, which pointed to the massive technological advances that existed in China in the 15th and 16th centuries, way ahead of anything in Europe at the time. And in India too, it was a very rich empire. The Mughal Empire was an extremely wealthy empire. Of course, it subsisted within a population that was very poor. So it was a very exploitative empire. I think that is also true of the Chinese. Possibly to a slightly lesser extent, it was less.
That last point is important. To say a society is one of the world's richest in the aggregate doesn't mean most of its people are living well, if just a few people hoard most of the wealth. As we heard last time, European peasants sometimes rose up against the aristocracy in the medieval period. But the powers that be always brutally suppressed those movements.
And it wasn't actually until about the middle of the 14th century, with the plague, that this story changed, that the fortunes of the peasant revolutionaries changed.
Jason Hickel is an economic anthropologist at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. He's talking about the Black Death, which wiped out a third to a half of the European population in the late 1340s, creating a severe labor shortage.
And this effectively strengthened the bargaining power of peasants and workers and weakened the bargaining power of the feudal lords. And the peasant revolutionaries recognized that this was an extraordinary opportunity, and they took it, and they managed to successfully overthrow feudalism. Feudalism basically collapses during this period, right?
Historians say by about 1400, the most restrictive form of feudalism, serfdom, had all but died out in England. Most peasants were no longer bound to their lord. They now paid rent in money and could move on if they could find a better deal on another manor. The diminished population also freed up land that effectively belonged to no one. So people shared it among themselves for subsistence farming, grazing, and hunting.
In the place of feudalism after its collapse, a more egalitarian, more democratic society emerged, where peasants and workers had more direct control over the means of production, along with basically collectively managed commons like the forests and the pastures and the rivers, etc. And the key principle that was at play here was that everyone should have access to the resources that are necessary for survival, right? This is considered kind of the right of habitation. And it was a remarkable period in the sense that that during this era, more or less from 1350 to about 1500, living standards of commoners improved pretty dramatically. We see nutrition goes up, welfare ratios go up in terms of real wages, rents go down.
Some historians have talked about a golden age for the European peasantry in that century and a half, as feudalist arrangements crumbled and capitalist systems had not yet risen on a large scale. Others say golden age is a wild exaggeration. After all, most late medieval peasants were extremely poor by today's standards. But most experts do agree the 1400s were a better time for ordinary working people in England and some other European countries, compared with their conditions before that period or after. Jason Hickel says it's crucial to understand that the vast majority of people in Europe did not choose capitalism, and many fought bitterly against it.
So this narrative that we have that there was some kind of smooth transition from feudalism to capitalism is just totally wrong, right? Like the rise of capitalism, it did not emerge from somewhere. It was imposed through a process of violence and, again, also colonization.
So we're in the city centre. The waterfront is in front of us here. At one point, this is how far the harbour would have come as well. So the ships would have come this far up. They would have got...
I've come to Bristol, the historic port city in southwest England, where this historian is showing me around.
So my name is Dr. Jessica Moody. I'm a senior lecturer in public history at the University of Bristol. So my research is about how we engage with the past, how we remember the past, how the past is sometimes used and abused for various ends. And I have a particular interest in the public memory of difficult histories, especially transatlantic enslavement.
Bristol, by the way, is just across Bristol Channel from Cosmoston Medieval Village in Wales, the place we visited last episode. We've traveled only 25 miles as the crow flies, but in our story, we're jumping ahead a few centuries.
And Bristol was a really important port, from the medieval period up to the sort of 18th century, early 19th century, and particularly during the 17th century into the 18th century when trade with the Americas opened up.
The British were not pioneers of the Atlantic slave trade, but once they got in, they went big. Portuguese and Spanish ships carried the first kidnapped Africans across the Atlantic in the 1520s, just a few decades after Columbus's voyages. The Dutch followed a century later in the 1630s. England founded its first slave trading corporation, the Royal Africa Company, in 1672. When that company's monopoly was broken in 1698, that's when Bristol's merchants jumped in. Given the city's location on the western edge of Europe,
it was really in a great position to trade with the Americans.
Ships from Bristol had previously sailed to ports in Ireland or elsewhere in Europe. Now some of them joined the triangular trade, sailing down to the coast of Africa, then west to the Caribbean and the Americas, and back. Those ships left Bristol loaded with goods from Britain and the continent.
So some of the steel or ironworks from Sheffield and Birmingham, and materials from Holland, weaponry, alcohol, metals that were taken and then traded for people, African people on the west coast of Africa, taken on the perilous Middle Passage, which could sometimes last about 3 months, very high mortality rates on that journey. Lots of people got sick and died, and then those people were then sold in the Caribbean or the southern states of America, and those ships then took slave-produced goods back on the return journey, so cotton, rums, sugar mainly.
Researchers estimate that between 1698 and 1807, ships that sailed from Bristol, more than 2,000 voyages, carried 500,000 kidnapped Africans into slavery in the New World, to work until they died on those sugar, tobacco, and cotton plantations. As we discussed in our Season 5 series, some historians make a powerful argument that large-scale projects of enslavement and colonization didn't just happen to get rolling around the time that capitalism was taking root in Western Europe. The claim is, instead, that those industrial-scale money-making schemes, built on the subjugation and exploitation of people and resources in Africa, Asia, and the New World, that those ventures were capitalism announcing its arrival. That might sound like a radical, lefty assertion, and sure enough, Karl Marx did make it. Here he is in Capital.
The discovery of gold and silver in America, the obliteration, enslavement, the burial of the aboriginal population in mines, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of blackskins, signify the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production.
In the 20th century, historians like Eric Williams, Cedric Robinson, and Walter Rodney documented how Europeans and European Americans developed new notions of race during the 15th to the 18th centuries, eventually constructing a highly codified racial hierarchy, with the people they labeled white at the top, African or black people at the bottom, and other non-European so-called races in between. These white supremacist ideas served to justify the colonization of distant lands and systems of slave-based production. This is Charisse Burden-Stelly, now a professor of African American Studies at Wayne State University, who explained in Season 5 how the term racial capitalism encapsulates these findings.
Racial capitalism is the idea that you can't understand capitalist exploitation and the capitalist world economy without understanding the processes of racialization and the forms of racial hierarchy that constitute that system.
It's no mystery why indigenous Americans, for example, view Christopher Columbus not as a great explorer, but as a symbol of conquest and genocide. Even while recognizing that he was just one man, if he hadn't been the first European to make those voyages, it would have been somebody else. Everyone knows that when Columbus landed in the Caribbean and South and Central America in the 1490s, he thought he'd reached India. But soon the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama did get there, by sailing the other way, around Africa's Cape of Good Hope, landing on the southwest coast of India on May 20th, 1498. If it seems like a radical, anti-capitalist argument to call those voyages an important starting gun for capitalism, it's striking, then, to see what Adam Smith, of all people, had to say.
The discovery of America and that of a passage to the East Indies by the Cape of Good Hope are the two greatest and most important events recorded in the history of mankind.
Adam Smith, the Scottish philosopher and the 18th century's greatest thinker on capitalism, in his landmark book, The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776. In this remarkable passage, Smith reflects on the pros and cons of those world-altering discoveries and what they unleashed. For him, looking at it from the British Isles in the 1770s, the pros outweighed the cons.
By uniting, in some measure, the most distant parts of the world, by enabling them to relieve one another's wants, to increase one another's enjoyments, and to encourage one another's industry, their general tendency would seem to be beneficial.
One another's is doing some serious work there, isn't it? These economic relationships across the world, by then 2.5 centuries old, had created great material benefit for some. But Smith did acknowledge the other side of the coin, what he called the dreadful misfortunes that befell people in the East and West Indies since Europeans had found their lands. And he saw plainly the reason for the disparity: benefits on one side, misery on the other. The reason? The imbalance of power, the more advanced ships and weapons that one side possessed.
At the particular time when these discoveries were made, the superiority of force happened to be so great on the side of the Europeans that they were enabled to commit with impunity every sort of injustice in these remote countries.
In the last episode, we made the point that before capitalism, the people at the top of the social order mostly just sat on their wealth, or spent it on cathedrals or castles or nice things for themselves. For the most part, they didn't leverage it to build new money-making capacity. Starting in the 16th century, this changed. By that time, elites had begun to see how they could amass bigger piles of wealth than ever before, and use those piles to make even bigger piles. The Western European aristocracies had strong motives for doing so. For one, they were constantly at war with one another. They needed gold and silver coin to build better armies and weapons. Enter mercantilism, a brand of capitalism designed not to lift the general welfare, but to fill the nation's coffers. Kingdoms sent ships across oceans to trade, consistently using force to colonize other lands, to take what they wanted for free or at a low price. By the time Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, the British East India Company was already ruling part of India. It would take control of the rest over the following century. And then the Brits show up with the East India Company, right? This is an exchange I had with Jayati Ghosh, the Indian economist. Sometimes Westerners will say, well, it's lucky for the likes of India that colonization happened because that's what developed, right? We, quote unquote, the West, developed places like India by bringing our more advanced societies and systems to that part of the world. What do you say to that?
Well, there's a lot of recent economic history research that suggests that the causation was really the other way around. That Europe was able to develop and able to find the resources to invest and have rapid capital accumulation because of the plunder that was enabled by these colonial powers.
Ghosh cites a recent book by two other renowned Indian scholars, Utsa Patnaik and Prabhat Patnaik, called Capital and Imperialism.
Which basically talks about the significant role played by the transfer, the drain from countries like India. India was one of the countries, but there were many others, in enabling not just the Industrial Revolution, but even the Agrarian Revolution before that.
In the early years of their trade with India, the British were more or less normal customers. They bought things like rice, textiles, and spices, and paid with silver, just like French traders in India. But the East India Company gradually colonized the subcontinent, starting with the Battle of Plassey in 1757. The British defeated a stronger Indian force thanks to a betrayal. The head of the Bengali army switched sides to help the Brits, in return for being made Britain's puppet ruler of Bengal. The British then used that foothold to push out the leaders of other Indian principalities, or pressure them to support British interests. As Britain gained complete control, it forced Indians to sell their products for low prices and pay more for British goods. It also imposed taxes on Indian peasants and small business people, and used those tax receipts to buy Indian goods. Under that scheme, the British weren't paying for the stuff they loaded onto their ships. Indians were. In their recent book, the Patnaiks analyzed historical records and came up with a stunning estimate that between 1765 and 1938, Britain extracted the equivalent of $45 trillion in today's money from India alone. Not only did Britain not develop India, British rule de-industrialized the country. In the 17th century, under the Mughal Empire, India was a world leader in manufacturing, textiles, leather, and metalwork, and claimed an estimated 1/4 of global GDP. By 1840, at a time when people in London were calling India the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, the chairman of the Oriental and China Association, Sir George Larpent, would say in a speech to the Parliament of Great Britain,
"We've succeeded in converting India from a manufacturing country into a country exporting raw produce."
Raw produce that Britain could then process and sell, adding still more to its wealth at India's expense. Economic historians have used data on wages and diets to estimate that the poverty level in India rose under British rule, that the average Indian was better off before the East India Company was formed in 1600. Every economist recognizes that a would-be capitalist needs capital to start a business of any real size, to buy materials, hire workers, and so on. Adam Smith called this previous accumulation.
A weaver cannot apply himself entirely to his peculiar business unless there is beforehand stored up somewhere, either in his own possession or that of some other person, a stock sufficient to maintain him and to supply him with the materials and tools of his work till he has not only completed but sold his web.
Marx used a slightly different phrase, the primitive accumulation of capital. He wrote about primitive accumulation not just at the level of the individual business person, but on a bigger scale. How did some nations first acquire the wealth that they then used to get much, much richer? The answer for Marx was theft. The theft of people's labor through enslavement, the theft of raw and manufactured goods through one-sided trading relationships leveraged by military power. And back home in Europe, the forced separation of people from the means to sustain themselves through projects like enclosure, which we're going to get to in this episode. Jayati Ghosh says Europeans have usually explained Britain's rise as a capitalist power by focusing on advances on the British Isles, an agrarian revolution starting in the 17th century, the Industrial Revolution a century later.
You can say that, yes, there were all these incipient changes in production relations within England, but the rapid expansion and the ability to invest so much came from all of that external surplus. Colonial loot, very broadly defined, played a significant role in providing the resources for that.
A lot of us non-historians, if we're asked to picture the early days of capitalism, will probably think of the Industrial Revolution, those Dickensian mills and factories. But we're not quite there yet. Before that revolution in Britain, and paving the way for it, a revolution in the countryside. In Episode 2, we talked about peasants under feudalism and the typical division in their lives. They'd work roughly half the time on the lord's land and the other half doing subsistence farming on their own smaller plots, assigned for their use under customary agreements, and on common lands that local peasant families shared.
And they will be given areas to graze for grazing for animals. They will be given certain rights. Rights, for example, to take wood from the woods so that they could use it to, for fuel.
That is Silvia Federici, the well-known feminist philosopher and social scientist, a professor emerita at Hofstra University.
By the 15th century and then more later, you begin to have a process whereby these peasants who had been sitting and working and reproducing themselves on the lands of the nobility, of the aristocracy, are increasingly expelled. And the process of expulsion is called the enclosure, because literally the lands that they used to have for grazing, for taking fuel, for agricultural product, they would be fenced off and they would be pushed off and then forced to continue to work in the same villages, but now for a pittance, for a wage.
Enclosure. I'll admit I had never heard of it until a few years ago, but it looms large in European history, nowhere more than in Britain. It marked a deep shift in how Westerners think about land. These days, certainly here in the U.S., we're used to the idea that every inch of property is either privately owned, an individual or, say, a corporation holds the deed, or it's public. And even with public land, we can point to the government entity that owns it, federal, state, county, city.
Get the hell off my property.
What? I'm just saying.
And don't come back.
That's from Breaking Bad. Throughout most of human history, people didn't treat land as personal property. In medieval times, in Europe and some other places, only kings and emperors owned land. Or think of indigenous people in the Americas, Africa, Australia, right up to the recent past and even today in some places. Tribes formed customary understandings about their territory and would sometimes fight over incursions or invasions. But individuals didn't draw lines and say, this patch of the earth is officially and legally mine.
Okay, but enclosure was a big deal.
Oh, enclosure was a huge big deal because...
Historian Eleanor Janega of the London School of Economics. She says enclosure shoved millions of people against their will out of the only life they knew in the countryside.
Where you have a community, where you have obligations that go both ways. So you have obligations to your landlord, but your landlord has obligations to you as well. And then that turns into... Land is owned, you need to get out of here, and I don't know, good luck to you,
Over several centuries, starting in the 1500s, the British Parliament passed thousands of acts, privatizing almost 7 million acres of formerly common lands, allowing landlords to send peasants away.
It's a displacement, when you had to go somewhere, and that somewhere was often towns and cities, and so it's a huge reimagining of what the workforce is.
Why does this happen? Janega says part of the answer is technology. In the same way that powerful machinery has whittled down the need for farm labor right up to the present, that happened hundreds of years ago too. Improved crop rotation practices, better, heavier plows, the use of horses instead of cattle to pull the plow faster. Many landowners stopped raising crops and got into the wool business because grazing sheep took a lot less labor and they could make bigger profits. All of these shifts, which many academics call the Second Agricultural Revolution, made farming more productive and shrank the need for peasant workers. As hard as the life of a peasant could be, a lot of peasants reacted to the enclosure movement with fury, and sometimes elites sympathized with them. Thomas More, best known as a Catholic writer, judge, and government official under Henry VIII, was a critic of enclosure. He wrote in his book Utopia in 1516 that because landlords were enclosing land and driving off peasants to raise wool, the sheep of England were, in effect, feasting on the people.
Forsooth, my lord, Your sheep were wont to be so meek and tame and so small eaters. Now, as I hear say, they become great devourers and so wild that they eat up and swallow down the very men themselves.
Thomas More also blamed enclosure and the resulting waves of rural refugees turned loose across the land for an alarming rise in vagrancy and theft.
Away they trudge, I say, out of their known and accustomed houses, finding no place to rest in. What can they then else do but steal, and then justly be hanged, or else go about a-begging?
Yeah, many people became vagrant. You know, the 16th century is the century of the great vagrancy.
Silvia Federici.
All these people without nothing, who do not want to submit to the new rules. They don't want to submit to the new forms of exploitation, who look at wage labor as a form of slavery. And they take the road. They become beggars. They become bandits. They become, people, sometimes migrant. So vagrancy is considered one of the main social problems in Europe of the 16th century.
Just as peasants had revolted against feudalism, now, a couple centuries later, people rose up against enclosure. The massive German Peasants' War in the 1520s came just a few years after Luther sparked the Protestant Reformation, and it was partly a religious war. But the revolt by German-speaking peasants was also a rejection of moves to privatize common lands and restrict access to forests and fishing and hunting grounds. It's been called the largest popular uprising in Europe before the French Revolution. To put down the revolt, the aristocracy slaughtered more than 100,000 peasants and farmers. In the summer of 1549, English peasants in the county of Norfolk started tearing down fences to protest the loss of their grazing lands and, for some, their homes. They confronted Robert Kett, a wealthy landowner who himself had enclosed common land. He was so moved by their complaints, the story goes, that he decided to join in and lead them. Eventually, thousands of rebels gathered and camped outside Norwich, England's second-largest city at the time, and issued a list of grievances. King Edward VI was only 11 years old, so the rebels directed their demands to his Lord Protector.
We pray your grace that no lord of no manor shall come upon the commons.
And
from henceforth no man shall enclose any more.
The rebels overran Norwich and occupied the city for a month. Finally, the Earl of Warwick assembled an army, including mercenaries from Germany and elsewhere, that overwhelmed the rebels and killed 3,000 or 4,000 of them. Dozens, maybe up to a few hundred, were hanged, including Robert Kett. The process of enclosure itself was often violent, too. It was still happening in the early 19th century, for example, with the clearances, as they were called, in parts of the Scottish Highlands. This was an account decades later by a woman named Betsy Mackay.
Our family was very reluctant to leave this place, and stayed for some time after the summons for evicting was delivered. But the landlord's party came round and set fire to our house at both ends, reducing to ashes whatever remained within the walls. The occupants had, of course, to escape for their lives, some of them losing all their clothes except what they had on their backs. The people were told they could go where they liked, provided they did not encumber this domain, the land that was by rights their own. The people were driven away like dogs.
Here's a poem from 18th century England, an outcry against enclosure.
They hang the man and flog the woman who steals the goose from off the common. Yet let the greater villain loose that steals the common from the goose.
Okay, John, you have taken us on a journey. There is a lot to unpack here. You've laid out two huge historic developments which happen in the same period from the 1500s forward.
Yes, and you know, just about everything in history is contested, including what capitalism is and when it started. But for our purposes, and this view is shared by many historians, these developments were pivotal in humanity's turn toward this capitalist world we live in now.
One of those developments came in the form of ships and swords and guns, the launch of colonial conquest and mercantilism, a kind of military capitalism. Let's go get what we can for our country by whatever means necessary sort of vibe. But that includes slavery on a massive industrial scale.
And that question of scale is crucial. Lots of people today, and I'm thinking of white folks here in the U.S., like to say, well, all through history, everybody did slavery. There was nothing new about the slave-based economy that Westerners built in the New World.
Well, that's about half right, isn't it? Slavery was commonplace across the world up until a couple hundred years ago, but it was often based on systems of caste, where people fighting wars would capture some individuals and haul them away as slaves.
Right, but to get at the point that this was something different, Professor Charisse Burden-Stelly again, with a clip that some listeners will remember from Season 5.
As many scholars have pointed out, slavery has been a feature of many societies, but slavery as an economic system and as the foundation of a particular mode of production is something that's unique to, let us say, the 15th century, 16th century onward.
I'm going to repeat some of those key words. Slavery as an economic system and as the foundation of a particular mode of production.
Here's another way of saying it. The system of chattel slavery that Europeans built in the Caribbean and the Americas, this was industry for the first time. The trade in human beings was a lucrative business by itself. People got seriously rich trading in enslaved Africans. And the colossal supply of unpaid labor that was delivered through large-scale racialized slavery, that labor was the engine of other enormous industries like sugar, tobacco, and cotton.
This was not some sideshow to the real economy. It was the economy. Those crops made nations rich. They were really kind of the oil of the early modern period.
This was capitalism now, dude. And I have to say it. When scholars talk about racial capitalism, the idea that race-based exploitation was baked into capitalism from the beginning, where's the lie?
Some historians like to debate whether the construction of a racial hierarchy, which served to justify exploiting some groups of people more extremely and brutally than others, whether that was necessary to give capitalism a running start, whether you could have had capitalism without that. I ran that question past Jayati Ghosh, the Indian economist, and as you can hear, she got a little impatient and called it a non-question.
How do we ever know whether it was necessary or not? We know that both happened together. And therefore, you can't really imagine one without the other. That we don't have the counterfactual.
The other big development you told us about happened domestically, within Britain and other European countries, the move to privatize land. Common lands that had been shared and available for ordinary people to use were now enclosed and fenced off. Owned, as Eleanor Janega put it.
Yeah, this drove countless people off the land, and as you can imagine, most of them wound up in cities looking for paid work. So this gives a big push to the transition in Britain and other countries in Western Europe from a rural population to an increasingly urban one. And even more on point for our story about capitalism, it pushes people into the new world of wage labor, where they have to go find an employer to sell their labor to.
That might sound like liberation and opportunity. People were turned loose to go make a life for themselves. But judging from the evidence about mass vagrancy and desperation, it kind of makes me think of that line in the song. Freedom's just another word for,
Nothing left to lose.
Boom.
Another takeaway, I think, is that these changes were still being driven by the few people at the top who owned everything, and for their benefit. we're a long way from anything resembling economic democracy. Regular working people had no say, and it sure doesn't seem like these world-changing developments improved the lives of most people.
If you think about the European peasantry and the many millions of people who would be enslaved or colonized or killed, it seems like the total amount of misery in the world, if you could measure it, probably went way up in the 16th and 17th centuries.
Even as, no doubt about it, this revving up of capitalist activity did create new piles of wealth through the exploitation of resources and labor. And that wealth was now starting to be reinvested in bigger and more lucrative forms of production. But of course, this wealth was not widely shared yet.
Yet, you say, and we're getting ahead of ourselves again, but today, people do look around and say, wow, humanity on the whole is way better off in material terms than we were in 1500 or 1600.
Yes, with a rather large caveat. I can't help thinking about the climate emergency when you say that.
Yes, the health of the natural world we all depend on is absolutely part of the picture when we talk about humanity being better off or not.
And that's something we'll come back to throughout the season. But yes, as far as people's standard of living, comfort, and health, I think in the ways that we typically think about those things, most of us would choose to be alive today over 500 years ago.
Inequality is still severe in much of the world, but now billions of people, a big share of the global population, have access not only to the basics of life, food, clothing, and shelter, but goods and conveniences that people couldn't dream of 4 or 5 centuries ago.
True. Then again, any economic historian would tell you that most of that dramatic improvement happened much later, over just the last 150 years, since about 1870. In a later episode, we'll explore why that is, what changed in the 19th and 20th centuries. And I think we'll find that capitalism is certainly part of that story. But we'll also find that it's too simple to just say, well, capitalism did it. Because again, look at what we've just been saying about capitalism's early days.
If we're placing the dawn of capitalism at the beginning of the 1500s, that means we had 350 years of capitalism before a large swath of humanity started to live with comfort and abundance.
Maybe capitalism isn't the sure ticket to human well-being all by itself. Maybe some other things had to happen.
So stay tuned, but it feels like we need to say a little more about these two big developments and what unites them. Colonization and slavery on one hand, and enclosure on the other. How are they related?
I think if we could put it into one word, it would be commodification. In Season 5, our climate series, we talked about thingification, quoting Aimé Césaire and Dr. King.
In other words, the fact that you're asserting ownership over aspects of the world that people previously didn't treat that way, or even think of in that way, and then using those newly objectified or thingified things to produce profit. In this case, we're talking mainly about land and human beings.
Human beings, you're claiming the right to enslave or colonize so you can steal their labor or buy it at a very low price. And land that had been shared and understood as a fundamental resource that provided a life and a way of life for everyone, however unequal and unjust those arrangements were. I'm going to play one more clip from our interviews. This is Silvia Federici talking about enclosure in Britain.
Because once the land is enclosed, once the land is not used for subsistence, for reproduction, then the land becomes a commodity. Then the land is either sold directly to the market, or the land is used for agriculture, but in agriculture to produce commodities for the markets.
So, parceling out patches of the earth for sale to the next owner and the next one after that, and treating human beings as chattel on a mass scale, all to leverage the accumulation of wealth like the world had never seen, seizing people and land and calling them capital. This was new in the world.
So before we go, and as we look ahead to episode 4, I think it's worth thinking about the ground we've covered here and where that leaves us, let's say in 1700. And in Britain, since that country is the focus of our story about early capitalism.
At that time, the British, well, the elites who are running things, are bringing in shiploads of goods and gold and silver from their far-flung and growing empire. That wealth is ready to be invested and employed as the scientific revolution progresses and people find new ways to use money to make more money.
Like mining coal, building steam-powered factories. And because enclosure has pushed an army of English people and Irish and Scottish and Welsh folks out of their rural life in villages, there's a large and desperate workforce in the cities ready to go to work in those factories and mills that are soon going to be everywhere.
We've described in this episode what happened, at least some of the biggest and most important things that happened as part of capitalism's Big Bang. Next time, more on why it happened, the social and cultural shifts that paved the way for capitalism and provided fuel for its rise.
Oh, and another important invention, without which most of this couldn't have happened: the corporation.
This episode was made by me with Ellen McGirt and our story editor this season, Loretta Williams. Music by Michelle Osis, Lily Hayden, and Alex Simcox. Music consulting by Joe Augustine of Narrative Music. Remote interview recordings by Ben James and Violet Luca. Voiceovers of historical writings by Ewan Kerr, Ian Bowater, Dirk Phillipson, and Katie Shields. Our website is scenonradio.org. This season is produced in partnership with Imperative 21. The show is distributed by our friends at PRX. Scene on Radio comes to you from the Kenan Institute for Ethics at Duke University.